Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our latest edition of Office Hours. Very excited about today's broadcast today. Got some very special guests. We're going to talk about using visual maps to understand complex problems and apply it to the world of systems thinking. And so our guests today, as I said, very excited. David Sibbet and Laurie Durnell from the Grove. Basically, they're the inventors to some degree and pioneers of this whole idea of visual mapping and facilitation. And as a sneak peek, they're going to give us a preview today of how they do that in real time. We have Larry Starr, who is been on the show before. And I'll let him quickly say a word about himself in just a second, but an expert in systems thinking. And to make sure we're practical, we have Elisa Johnson, who's the Chief Human Resource Officer of Brown & Toland. Who's also been a previous guest to the show. But welcome all and welcome to listening. Just a real quick around the horn. David, do you want to get started? A quick hello.
Yes, I'm the founder and CEO right now of the Grove Consultants International, and we're a full-service organizational consulting firm, process consulting, doing meetings, teams, strategy, and change work. And I've been pioneering this visual practice work for years and finding that it's a doorway to systems thinking. So this is a very appropriate sort of conversation to be having.
Great. No, thank you. Laurie?
Hi, my name is Laurie Durnell, and I'm the practice lead for team performance at the Grove Consultants International. And what I do in that particular role is I take all of these ideas around working visually and working with systems and giving them real practical applications with teams that are just working to get their work done, that are developing strategy, that are in the process of change, et cetera, which we are all in right at the moment. So that's the focus of my practice. I've been doing that for about 20 years.
Great. Welcome. Larry?
My name is Larry Starr, and I'm the director of two doctoral programs at Thomas Jefferson University. One is a PhD in complex systems leadership, and the other is a Doctor of Management in strategic leadership. My work is about systems and complexity, both at the academic level and at the practice level. And so I've done considerable consulting in both of these over the past number of years. Glad to be here.
Great. And Elisa?
Hi, I'm Elisa Johnson, and I am the Chief Human Resource Officer for Brown & Toland Physicians that's based out of Oakland, California. And I have been in the HR field for more than 20 years. And I am looking forward to our time together with the Grove. I'm bringing, as Joe had mentioned, the practicalities to this time together, have worked with the Grove in various organizations, and am also a certified facilitator of their team performance model.
Now, great. And again, we're talking about this pre-show. Elisa was one of the connectors of all of us, because when she was running executive talent at United Health Group, she had been working with both myself and the EDP and the Grove, and we had kind of crossed paths. And I was always impressed with seeing these maps all over the wall that were part of the program. As a matter of fact, as we think about our agenda today, this is what we're talking about. And you can see that Dave's already starting in real time to start to describe this, because I started to talk about an agenda. And we wanted to talk about three things, because number one, these are the people that do visual mapping, and they do it well, and they teach people how to do it. And we want to know more about that in just a second. Other thing is, these are the people that are behind the Drexler Sibbet performance model for teams. And they have a very academically vetted and well-used globally team performance model that we're going to talk about, which is very important today. And most importantly, they also teach visual facilitation, which I think goes back to Larry's side about, how do you take these complex systems and help people understand them? And, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And I think that's actually a skill that will benefit us here today. So very excited about what we're able to do the show. And David and Laurie have also agreed to kind of draw the show as we continue to work. So we're going to kind of get a little bit of a skill assessment as well. So very excited to see that in real time. But maybe as we get started, David, Laurie, how do you even approach this? Like when you're presented like with all this kind of complex topics, where do you start? How do you teach people how to do what you're doing?
Why don't you start out, Laurie?
Yeah. So this little picture here shows, in essence, kind of the roots of the of where our work arose. You have a situation where you've got a group of people that are coming together. They're going to solve some particular kind of a problem. In this particular instance, we have the team performance model on the back wall. So we could imagine that this might be a team that's coming together, and it's a global team. Or it's just a team where everybody is just, down the street from each other, but they're still working just like a global team. And what we discovered is that when you're just talking, you're limited to one channel. And so you can see someone's rolling a large sheet of paper up on a wall, or you could imagine a virtual whiteboard. You can see someone's there with a computer. And when you put the conversation on a wall, so that people can see the evolution of their thoughts as they go, then people are much more effective at understanding each other. I mean, there's a term that we use, which is, "Oh, I see what you mean," as kind of this insight. And so this is what it looks like when it's in action.
Mm-hmm.
So just out of curiosity, Larry, you're our systems thinking guru, and you're the one that kind of puts together the process. What are you thinking about this?
Well, let me, go ahead, Scott.
I think it's way cool. It's a great tool. There's conversations going on academically and in practice, and I'm sure the Grove Group knows this, as well as Elisa, about are there styles of learning, or how do people learn best, perhaps? And it's related to the whole sense of if you have a problem, how do you even know how to understand it? And so the two get connected there. One way is some people are argued to be visual learners. And even if you're not a visual learner by primary preference, it's helpful for most people to be able to not only hear words and see the printed word, but actually see images of it. And I think the second related way is the most difficult part of a problem is the definition, the formulation of the problem. Before you can decide to do anything, you have to be all on the same page, hold a similar mindset about what it is that's going on so that you act appropriately. I had a colleague who said, if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter what route you take. And so part of the moving forward is to figure out, well, what is the situation right now? And so I think the images are really helpful. I haven't seen them beyond this one, but I think the idea of both the active aspect of it, the fact that it's ongoing, is probably a contribution to the images that you're seeing.
Well, what's interesting is, sorry, in systems thinking, I know you guys had a conference not too long ago where they said, somebody at the conference had made a comment, I forgot who it was, but he said that babies kind of are born to think about the world from a systems point of view because they're kind of learning as they are doing. And it's almost like we get them into the school and we train them not to think that way anymore. And we instill in them this kind of scientific method, which is much more linear thinking. And we kind of go away from these approaches that we're seeing here today.
Yeah, that's an old saw that goes on in the literature as well. The one that I heard originally was that babies are born eidetic thinkers, which is to say everything that comes in, they recognize and hold it. And it's only later that a few small percentage of people have this eidetic or photographic memory. And the argument about how you lose it is it's encultured out. Western society forces linear thinking and linear problem solving and takes away the broader perspective that apparently you need as a human being, growing up in the jungles where everything is environmental, and you're forced into the machines that we use now. So,
what was
yeah,
that
sure.
term you used, Larry? Eidetic?
Eidetic, yeah. It's called eidetic memory, and it's sort of the scholarly word for photographic memory.
And so we get a whole image when we're kids. We just absorb it in on all these channels.
Right. Now there's a downside here. The thing about eidetic memory is not only do you see it all and hold on to it, but it stays with you, which means you can't forget all the terrible things that ever happened. And so it has its positives, but it's not a complete benefit.
So, Laurie, Elisa, how do you, I like the start of this, but how do you do this in the corporate environment? So when you walk in and you're dealing with this kind of jumbled mess of a problem, very complex system, where do you start to get people in the facilitation world? Laurie or Elisa, you want to take that?
Elisa, why don't you go ahead and jump in, and then I'm going to actually invite David to share. I don't know if David, you want to share that story about the conversation that you had in Singapore. I think that image, if you got it, would potentially be a really good one to answer that question visually. Elisa?
Yeah, well, first of all, in terms of this is what the great thing is around the grow process, because it's steeped in process. And so you've got the parts and the whole as we're talking about systems thinking. So when you're walking into a room, there's an enablement already of a conversation because you see these different maps that are up and relevant for the problem that you're trying to solve. So whether it is around some visioning work that you're trying to do, working through complex areas around a context in terms of what's happening out in the marketplace and what do we need to pay attention to so that we can see around the corner in the organization, all the way down to what's our process and approach. So it's not just about, thinking that you're coming in and there's these cool visual items. It really is steeped in the research around a process that you can go through. And so in terms of the whole and the parts, and where do you begin? So I think that what I have found is that initially there's curiosity when you walk into the room and you see maps that are up and visualization. And then as everyone is completing everything holistically, different parts of the problem that you're trying to solve in various areas of the room, it just, it's the opportunity to come together on details, but then see the big picture overall as well.
Okay.
Yeah, David, the other slide that we could show us that is I think the one on team performance that shows the whole system, AEIO.
That's what I was wanting to go was if you're walking into a room and standing there and it could be anything. I mean, just the things that Lisa just mentioned are in a whole bunch of different levels. So we've used our thinking and our visualization at the simplest level of appreciating that you've got a range between a top line kind of orientation that people have where your awareness and your consciousness can operate. And the bottom line considerations, which is budget, time, and materials. And this is one of the perplexities of the human experience, is that we are visionary, imagineers, creative types in one way, and we have to eat 3 times a day and do other things and actually pay bills at the other level. So if you divide it into 4 things, we found that this channel of inspiration and alignment can be supported with imagery, metaphor, and just reflecting and giving space in a process for people to have that. But at the same time, you've got a collaborative stream, which is really the experience of being in the room. And I think you were mentioning the interactive part. there's something absolutely fascinating about having what you say written down. And there's a time delay, and people's minds begin to, they're pattern seeker. What is that recorder writing down? Well, if you really get it right, there's an emotional connection. If you are slightly off, people get all engaged in correcting you. And so if you are good at accepting the corrections and really deeply listening, you can't really lose. I mean, you're going to get high engagement here at this level of energetics almost every time you work this way. But then Elise was mentioning this big systems thinking stuff. I do think that systems thinking at its simplest level is seeing the parts and the whole together and how the parts interact and how they're connected. Well, that requires making a display. So the act of making a display democratizes systems thinking for the group. And the fact that they're co-constructing it means there's a lot more understanding. And then finally, bottom line, it's possible to actually visualize the actual infrastructures that we all work with, because those are physical. I mean, you can draw computers and everything else, and you can actually do a lot to map the base resources in a systematic, structured way. So we're spanning from imagining to analyzing to actually co-designing and constructing. So that blank sheet of paper there for us is really a potential display space on these 4 channels.
And one of the things that the Grove believes is that this whole idea is, if you are going to kind of co-create and co-understand a really complex system or a wicked problem or that kind of thing, you actually need to bring whole human beings to bear to that. You need to bring our capacity to imagine what's going on, because most complex systems have some parts that are visible and many parts that are invisible, and how things structure and change over time. That's your imaginal space. So you need to be able to bring that kind of part to bear. You need to be able to bring the ability to listen to each other and to hear new perspectives and to shift your mental models to accept other people's mental models. And you need to be able to do that as a mature adult, as opposed to my way or the highway. And then eventually you need to be able to move all of these ideas into, your practical making kind of self. And so that, and imagine how the system that you're creating actually impacts. So that whole body brought into the conversation actually enhances individuals' ability to come together and then understand a whole system. It's kind of like vehicle and yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, Laurie. It sounds a lot like you're describing a design thinking process.
That is precisely what we're describing.
So there's a lot of similarity.
The people who began this field, Joe, is interesting. In the 70s, when we were first starting to do all this, were both architects and believed that way of thinking would work more generally. And I was actually enrolled in architecture school at one point. And so I was very influenced by that thinking. We didn't call it design thinking. We called it, architectural thinking or being designerly. And it's exactly what we're doing.
Well, it's interesting that architects rely on blueprints. And in a way, this starts to develop the blueprint for the problem that we're trying to solve.
Larry, I'm really curious if this whole hypothesis about bringing whole people into a conversation and the ability of, if you bring whole people in the conversation, actually enhances people's ability to both, understand whole systems, but also to imagine all the parts of them, put them together, et cetera. I'm just curious whether you think that hypothesis holds, or my experience of that holds up.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here. A lot has been said, as you say, in a short time. But let me sort of answer some of this sideways. What I think you're aiming to do is to enable people to see and think in systems. Now, this is not a trivial task. Most of the academic literature suggests that 90% of the people who are out there do not think in systems. People may be born one way or the other, but it is not something that people take easily, because so much of the world around them is deconstructed into small parts and improving pieces rather than seeing things as a whole. And so the idea of what you're doing seems to be a process to help people see situations and potentially options to act in a systems way. Now, there are sort of fundamental premises about how you do that. First, no one's really figured it out very well. Most of the people who work in systems academically and elsewhere say they fail. We run all these courses with all of these students, at the end of which people get good grades, but they go back where they came from and they don't think in systems. They think analytically and evidence-based. So how do you actually get people to think this way? And part of where you're going is actually one person's theory, Marv Weisbord, who said you have to bring everybody together. It is a whole thing. And so you have to fill the whole house with the whole people and start focusing on these issues of language and image that come together. Now, by what method does this work? And again, you have to separate, what are you doing? It sure works here. But then when you leave the room, what is retained and applied in this same way so that the outcomes that you're actually trying to enable are systemic?
Actually, Larry, sorry, can I stop you right there? I want to show Elisa really quick. Elisa, help us with that. When people went through EDP at UHC or other programs you've been working at Brown and Tolan, what impacts did they get that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten, that you really saw in the real world based on this type of an approach?
Well, yeah, first of all, as I had mentioned, visualization prompts curiosity. So you're creating space for conversations for everyone's voice to be heard. So whether it's around team performance model, talking about not just what we want to achieve as a team, because that's a lot of what we think with bottom line, but at the same time, it's how we're going to be as a team. And that's kind of the dynamics that's in it. So your opportunity to accelerate work through this process, when you build relationships, when you have context around each other and you've got a framework to work off of, it really does accelerate the opportunity to problem solve. So you're talking about EDP. When I was leading our executive development program, we gave and provided real life business challenges that people had to work on in cross-functional, cross-department, global teams. So you're bringing groups of people together from around the world who are in different positions, different roles, and they're coming together to solve a real life business challenge. So having them go through and be a part of understanding the dynamics of a team and the challenges that teams face, not just the challenge of your challenge, but the challenge that your teams face, and addressing that really accelerated their ability to come up with even greater solutions from my perspective in many facets and dimensions.
Well, actually, Elisa, build on this as you're answering, like your opinion on this question, because as you're talking, somebody just posted this in the chat, and you could just go a little further and talk about the implementation side. So did it help with the implementation as well, since they solved the problems by doing this?
Absolutely, yeah. I collected data as well in terms of just in terms of how many solutions actually got implemented as a result. And so, really probably about 50 to 60% of our solutions that came out of working these cross-functional, global teams coming together to work on a solution, a business challenge. 60% got implemented into the organization. There was 100% new learning for the organization as well, meaning insight the organization didn't have previously from when this team was working on these challenges. So, and that way other places in the organization got to have the opportunity to capitalize on that information. So again, this was the opportunity for teams to not just work on a challenge and focus on let's get to solution. It was also about, when we think about the systems view, who are we and how are we going to work as a team? How are we going to come together? What are the kinds of challenges that we know we face as a team in those dynamics as well?
So go ahead, David.
Yeah, one of the typical challenges that a team has is knowing the difference between a work group that just has some goals in common and trusted leader and a team that's interdependent. And so this model actually invites that conversation by saying these four things, the why, who, the what, the how, or what we call orientation, trust, goal, clarity, commitment. These are the foundations for then the whole implementation and sustaining side of teams. And the problem that you get is if people are in a planning meeting over here, in a flip chart, and they're figuring all these kinds of things out, if you think you can do it analytically by just understanding all the pieces, you don't get it until you know that you have to sequence things. And sequencing turns out to be the thing that unlocks the energy. So this invites you not thinking in just the beginning part of team building, but it actually invites you to think about the implementation side from the very beginning. It's interesting, Larry, as an aside, this initial model came out of the Gibb Drexler Weiss board model. It was, Marv was part of working with Jack Gibb on doing social science research around groups following this progression when they join a team.
Yeah, it looks like it.
So sorry, David, can you or Laurie give a practical example of that sequencing? Like what does that mean? How do you sequence? What is that? Just so the listeners understand what you're talking about.
Well, I just drew a little graphic of a sequence. A sequence is deciding on what's first, second, and third. The person I learned strategy from right now has been working a lot with mid-sized companies that don't have professional strategy staffs and HR staffs. And he's developed a template that he calls the river journey template. And it's basically a river. And what happens down here at stage 4 to 5 is he's asking people to sequence the projects that they're going to do through the metaphor of what boat are you putting down the stream first. And you'll resonate with this, Laurie, being running a kayak company in the past. But he's found that the simple act of getting people to decide on what's going to be the lead and what follows unleashes all kinds of energy. Now that seems super simple, but there are many, many, many organizations that just get stuck and can't make the turn to sequencing. And that's different than saying you're never going to do boat number 2 or never going to do boat number 3. As you're not making a final decision, you're just deciding on how you're going to move energetically through the situation you're in. And right now, with so much uncertainty, probably the most important thing for people to do is to know what they're going to do next and to have some real good reasons behind that. Now, it turns out it's also useful to have a North Star up here as a general purpose that you're heading toward. But if you get the next action connected with a North Star, you've got a pretty good unlock for the problem of people being kind of frozen. And visualizing it, as Larry was saying, it's just exercising and building a mental model of that sequence in people's minds.
Well, it seems, Larry, just as you're thinking about this, it seems like the problem with system thinking, from my point of view, is what David's describing is people build these systems and they don't know what to do about them. So does this resonate with you in terms of, your approach to systems thinking?
Oh my. So again, most people use the word system, but it doesn't mean they think that way. And symptoms and system thinking is an approach to thinking. It's a kind of methodology and a theory simultaneously. I used to think about it like psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is both what you do in therapy, but it's a theory that explains how the therapy operates. And I think of systems thinking the same way. It's a way of seeing the world. I'm impressed by David's start in architecture. That's where Russell Akoff started. Began as an architect and then moved into management philosophy and created his whole theory almost through images from his own education. The part of systems thinking that I like, that seems to connect here, has to do with what are you actually modeling? Are you modeling any of the following three things? So one is, what's the problem? How do you describe that in images and words and activity and processes? What's happening? Second, what are you going to do? And part of that is a conflict for me because systems are nonlinear. There is no step one, step two, step three. That's the problem with a system. It's constantly in motion and you can barely comprehend it. So you have to make a stab at it. And so you must begin to do something. You can't do everything simultaneously, but what you're doing is directed at the whole, not directed at the immediate sequence, but at a much larger image. And I think Laurie was saying that as well. But here's the part that I think has yet to be addressed. And that is, where exactly are you going? What's the system and what would it look like if this problem was dissolved? If what you were trying to do was no longer a challenge, what does that system look like? And if you can use this kind of methodology and set of tools to generate the potential state that you want to get to, and you can see that, just as you can see the initial state as being a real big mess, if you can see part of the end state, then you can work backward as well as forward, because you can get to it by successive approximations. That's the sequence. Getting back from where you want to be is sometimes called backcasting, rather than forecasting. But the fact is you have to see the beginning, the middle, and the end in effect simultaneously. That's the real challenge. And the more complex the problem, the more difficult it is to even comprehend that. So I don't know if I'm helping you get through the answers to the questions you're asking.
Well, Larry, I would just say systems are nonlinear. The context is nonlinear, constantly interacting. But within systems, there are flows, and the flows definitely have linearity in them, in that they have time dimension and sequencing. So that's part of the both and problem, is how do you think in terms of flows and energetic movement at the same time you're thinking of the whole systems mesh, right. It's buzzing interaction.
Right. So that's a system dynamic view, and it's a kind of a modeling, engineering, control, and sequencing point of view. And that's a great way to apply this, because I think most organizations would like that perspective, because they can see it, they can hold it, they can review it, and they can make sense of it. In complex systems, that model doesn't work so well. And so the more difficult the situation, the more the individual modeling is not as useful. But I don't want to go too far afield here. I think what you're doing is really great, and I think it's making a real contribution. And part of the challenge, again, is How do you actually get the people to think this way together? And then how do you sustain that when it's over? Because what you're talking about is not only a way of thinking, but a cultural perspective on how we look at problems and try to address them. I think that's the real force here.
Laurie, I think you've been working on culture, so why don't you take that one?
Well, I was going to say a practical aspect of how it is that you do this is that you give people a whole system view. And that's what the team performance model does, is that it gives people a whole system view. Because a lot of times when an organization, let's say I've got a team and we're having some kind of trouble. We're facing a problem where we've got some interpersonal stuff that's going on, and people have a tendency to want to go in and fix one piece of it. So this little example that we've got here is a team that I was working with, where it was a finance leadership team for a global company with business units all over the world, big pharma. And they called us up to help them because they were not aligned on implementing their different business agreements as a finance team. And so that was the presenting problem. So there's this great temptation to say, well, let's fix that. But they weren't looking at the whole system, which is, when we got in and started looking at what was going on, we realized that there was really uneven commitment to actually who was leading the team, and are these initiatives things that we actually want to work on. And this was leading to a huge betrayal of trust on the team. So, depending on a particular person's, way of operating the world, one person might say, let's fix what's not working with the implementation. Another person might work on, we need to get clear on our decision-making processes. And another person might say, and this is a typical thing that people do, is when things aren't working on the team, let's go do team building, let's go bowling or something like that.
Actually, Laurie?
Yeah?
We had a question from the audience, because I was actually thinking about the same thing simultaneously. Yep. So I want to come back to this, but I want to ask that you do everything you said. What about the people that aren't in the room? Because I was thinking about the same thing. Like, I was working with a big healthcare system, $6 billion system. They didn't use you, but they built these cool maps. And then they started showing the maps to the other people in the organization. And people looked at me like, I don't get it. It was like Tom Hanks and Big.
Yeah, the maps don't do it.
And so how do you, how can this be taken to other parts of the organization effectively?
Well, culture, the DNA of culture is storytelling. And so the maps themselves include all the information, but what they're missing is the story. And the story needs to be brought to life and enacted through the leadership in the organization and through, the people who are, impacted by or own the different parts of the map. And so if you just push a map out, it's like pushing out data. And people don't have a context. They don't have a sense of who's the villain, who's the hero. These are the things that engage us as humans. And Elisa, I see you're nodding your head. There's got to be an example of this from the work that you guys have done. Why don't you share something on that?
Yeah, I'm going to go very, very practical here. I mean, part of this, when I was part of a large healthcare organization that Joe is talking about, when we think about systemically the leader's role through, it just wasn't an executive program. There were expectations around that these executives had to build capability in their teams around the team performance model. So we would follow up to say, how are you even applying this to your own teams? And so it was, when we talk about culture and the cascade of this, and to Laurie's point, this isn't just about a map and what we solved, it's the capabilities that we're building in the organization, and what's the accountability around that. And you got to follow up with that and measure that and provide it out to the organization as well. And so it's not just about, hey, I went through this nice program, I got my certificate, done. No, there's an aspect here of measurement where you are actually measuring the capabilities that you're building on your team. So things even like, what's your team engagement pre going into the program and post going into the program? Things like, are you as a leader, since you've gone through this program, where else have you moved in the organization from a development standpoint, from a new role, from a progression in the organization? So that's just taking it real practical in terms of the fact that this is an enabler, but it's also about building the capabilities in the organization around this. So when we talk about the part in the whole, and Laurie, I know you probably have some more use cases around this as well. So yeah, this just isn't about, here's a nice model. It's around, okay, let's measure how you're building those capabilities now among your people that are reporting up through you also. And you've got to prove that. But that only happens if the organization makes that a priority, that measurement aspect.
I do want to come back. Sorry, David, were you going to say something?
At some point, if you want to see an example of how story mapping can help implement, I can share an example of it. But go ahead, Joe,
sure.
with what you're saying.
No, show the example, because what you're showing the example, my thought was just, as Elisa's talking, and to some degree with Laurie's point, I'm curious how this maps when you have scenarios. So I don't know what's going to happen. So just as an example, I'm doing an assignment with my students about what's going to happen to the economy next year. And part of it is predicated on who wins the US election in November. And we could have a completely different outcome if one party or the other wins. And so the question is, I can't tell you what's going to happen because it's somewhat dependent on some other things that are going to essentially create, I guess, a scenario. So I need a scenario for one, scenario for other. How do you handle scenarios and uncertainty in this process? Just out of curiosity.
Well, what's coming up for me is thinking through what your actual objective is and taking people into scenario planning. We did at one time for Hewlett Packard trying to figure out their scenarios for IT. And they had a very simple kind of scenario map, which is the system open or is it closed? Is it proprietary or is it open source? And so an open source kind of thing is where you're doing social media. Social media is kind of open source and free. And a closed proprietary system would be if you get into a big SAP implementation, where you're integrating the entire darn thing. And then you have combinations. So they actually were facing a management team that it wasn't clear what way they were going to go. They were in a transition. And would they end up wanting to go, and do that, or were they ending up going with Linux or something and making their own thing? They did scenarios in order to prepare themselves to be nimble. So it's called, when we worked with Peter Senge and those folks in Global Business Network, it's the concept of being preceptive. So the workout that you do with visual scenario work is really working the mental modeling so that it's not too narrow. But it could be that your scenario work is not just trying to come up with concepts about the scenarios. It could be that what you want to do is break up some solidified relationships that are too stuck. So we did scenario planning with Nike around global warming.
Well, but I want to stop you because, and again, I'm going to go back to a different episode we had with Larry when we asked him about the definition of complexity. And he had a really very simple and straightforward definition. I don't know if you remember it, Larry, about how the past doesn't describe the future. Do you remember what you said?
I don't remember what I said, but I know there are half a dozen different definitions of complexity, and one of them comes from cognitive psychology. That was the one that you liked.
Yes.
And the idea of complexity from a cognitive psychology perspective is an event for which you don't have a mental model, and you experiencing it, and it's just something that you can't wrap your head around, and you begin to say things like, "I've never seen anything like this before," which is a statement we hear routinely in the press by most of the people who are describing the ongoing world in which we are living. And if you've never seen anything like this before, you don't have a pathway. All you have is this awareness that, holy mackerel, what am I supposed to do now? And in the language of systems and complexity, you navigate it. You try to anticipate as much as you can, and that's sort of the value of potential scenario planning. But whatever scenario you have figured out, that's not what you see. This is different. You know, what happens if the president refuses to accept X? What happens if we don't know who wins? What happens if COVID mutates and suddenly everything changes and everything shuts down? And what happens when they all mix together? What are you supposed to do? Where's the plan? And that is dynamic complexity as opposed to structural or mechanical or other kinds of language here. Again,
okay. Larry, sorry. Thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. Because if I'm a leader of an organization facing dynamic complexity, and it seems like one of the things that Laurie and David that you're advocating is having a vision, and I don't have a vision for the solution. Like, how does your approach help me, or is there an approach that you've used in that situation that can help me, or am I just beyond hope?
Well, one thing is getting people to actually experience each other as not having a mental model is part of the battle. One of the problems with people in organizations who are in positions of leadership is they think they ought to lead. And they don't, if they don't know what's going on, don't have a mental model, they'll make up something anyway just to look like they're leaderly. Yeah. And you get all kinds of suboptimal responses to things. So having leaders who know how to be learning leaders, and I'm using the word learning as kind of a proxy for navigating. If you have somebody who says, you know, I really don't know how we're going to do this, but what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to do blended planning because half our people aren't in the office anymore. And I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but we're going to learn how to do that. There are people who are actually very adept at being uncertain in a leadership role, but that's an underdeveloped muscle. And part of what happens with this visualizing thing is that you experience regular breakdowns in certainty. You experience a breakdown of the mental models that are too limited, and that's I'm really agreeing with what Larry's saying about the experience of this. Is these dynamic systems are a little bit like weather systems that are inherently unpredictable.
So let me add a little point. One of the great things about systems is that there's no single point. It is the amalgam, the integration of so many different ways of looking at the world and information. And one of the ideas that's generated from it is that to best navigate, you need what's called the requisite mindset. The great collection of people who can think in different ways and who can collaborate on a sort of sudden instant to come together and say, holy mackerel, we've never seen anything like this before, but how will we look at what we've got in a way that we share an understanding so that we can begin to figure out what to do? And if all you do is pick up the telephone and talk to each other, you're not going to do very much. If you have a kind of collaborative tool, something that says, okay, everybody go here, let's look at this. Eddie, what do you think? Debbie, what do you think? How is it coming apart? And somebody is painting the picture. You generate these kinds of novel opportunities because the image generates an idea, which then becomes another image, which became something verbal. And I think that's why the tool has the promise of being able to be more helpful. And the more you practice with it, and the more it gets out to more people, I think that's the sort of the way to do that, is to bring people together, but then find people who don't normally think this way, get them in there too, and suddenly that's the cascade.
Mm-hmm.
The more people who share the way of thinking with a methodology, with a tool, I think the better off you are when you hit these terrible situations, which are increasingly common, alas.
To actually get managers to take time to do that, I found one way to explain it, and this is kind of a tip in some ways, is to advocate for doing revisions. So if we do a story map, we don't just do 1.0, we do 2.0, 3.0, and we point to the computer industry and say, you all know what 1.0 software is like. Well, our first version of what we're going to do is like that. So let's do revisions. And people seem to get that doing an iterative set of revisions, that sounds practical. This is kind of a design thinking idea, but it's basically doing what you're just describing. It's creating an envelope for collaborative process of bringing people together, particularly with stakeholders who have a requisite coverage of the material, and new stuff pops right out if you can get them to go into the iterations.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
David,
I think that,
go ahead, Larry. Go ahead, Larry.
I'm just saying that, and the more tools you use to bring into this, the better. That's the idea of Web 3.0, which it's interactive, fully interactive, and visually interactive, and communicative, and it generates new knowledge in itself, which then gets transmitted elsewhere. And that's, again, what you seem to be describing here.
So David, can you bring back your team performance model graphic? Because one of the things I like about it, as I said, there's a lot of team performance models. But the one thing that always resonated with me, back to the picture's worth 1,000 words, is I like the V, because it basically says that things are going to get worse before they get better. And I like that little broken trust icon that you had on there as well, because trust erodes. That's a problem with the process. So direct question for Laurie. Where's the quicksand here? Where do organizations fall apart as you're walking through this process?
I think that the place that organizations fall apart, there's a couple different places, and Elisa probably has had some practical experiences with this as well. Some places where teams fall apart in this process is thinking that if we all go bowling together and have a happy time together, that all our problems are going to be solved. So a challenge is, in essence, over focus on, one area as the full solution. So we took the Myers-Briggs, the StrengthsFinder, we sort of applied it, and now all of our problems are going to be solved. So that's one way that things can fall apart. Another way that things can fall apart is leaping stages. So, for instance, I get a charter as a team leader, and where all our time is constrained, we go straight to implementation, and we're running really, really, really fast. And I look over at you, and you're going right, and I think we should be going left. And I'm literally asking, what are we doing? Which is the stage 3 question, because we skipped that stage. So that's another area where things fall apart. Another area where things fall apart.
Sorry, Laura, to interrupt you. I want to make sure. So you're really saying that the process has to follow these stages, and when people don't follow the stages, that's when things go amiss?
They don't need to follow the stages in order, because it's inherently messy.
Yeah.
But they do need to touch them, and they need to get people aligned on them. Elisa, you want to add to that? I can see you nodding.
Yeah, I think of it, this is what I do love about the metaphor here and their visual. It's not just about the V. These are different balls that you're constantly juggling up in the air. And so these are 7 challenges teams face. And to Laurie's point, you're juggling them constantly. And if you're not touching each one of them or understanding them along the way, then that's where things can really break down. So if you're constantly just focused on the goals and the roles, let's say, and you're not touching the trust aspect or the orientation piece, the team is going to fall apart. So that's how I think of this more so of is you're constantly juggling these, these 7 challenges and elements of a team.
Part of the graphic challenge, Joe, is interface design for these kinds of graphics. When Windows and the Mosaic browser came out, that's when the internet took off. The metaphor of Windows made sense to people. Suddenly, it wasn't totally confusing ASCII prompts and all that kind of stuff. The linearity of this bouncing ball idea is simply an interface design. And what Elisa is pointing to is that once you're past the interface, you're into the actual application. And the actual application is dynamic in the way that Larry's been talking. But people need to have an interface that doesn't scare them so that they can enter into that juggling act. You don't start learning to juggle by doing 5 balls at the beginning.
So David, following up on that, we got a question, which whoever's in the audience, we're actually thinking about the same thing at the same time. How do you juggle in a virtual environment? Because now we're scattered and we don't have the ability to get everybody together. Does that change things?
It does change things.
It does change things. I was going to actually point to that in our initial team performance model, that set of balls hits the platform and it's resting on the platform. And the platform represents the organization and organizational leadership, because that platform has to show up strong in order for the team to be able to really bounce. And the challenge that we have right now is that everything's disconnected in terms of physical connection. But the thing that I've been really quite fascinated with is that I'm finding that people are actually working more closely together now that everybody is on a level playing field, in terms of you don't have half of a team that is co-located in the corporate headquarters, and then you got folks who are out in the divisions, they're running their own shtick, et cetera. And so I'm seeing more and more a dynamic where people are all having to come together on an equal playing field of, chiclet-sized images of each other. And have conversations, and that some teams are actually finding that they're working more effectively in this environment than they were previously. Quite fascinating.
Well, they still make chiclets?
It's a term for gallery view and Zoom.
I remember chiclets.
Yeah, the little things. A thing that's really problematical about the virtual space, and which has been a huge part of our work, is when we get in a real face-to-face room and you're mapping what people are doing panoramically, people get into something I would call, in common language, panoramic thinking, or which I've found that if I start talking systems thinking, people start glazing over in a lot of settings. And but panoramic thinking. But when people begin seeing the history on one wall, the vision on another wall, the action plan on the middle wall, and they've been in there for 7 or 8 hours, and then they go through an overnight and they come back, people have a chance to upgrade their mental models in the process. In a virtual thing, number one, you can't meet as long. 2, there is more control required to kind of jump around and do stuff. Like I'm jumping around with a lot of visuals here, partly, but I'm really completely comfortable with my tools. The number of people who are really comfortable sketching online and everything is still pretty limited. And, you start toggling in and out of, well, what did we say at that last meeting? How do you bring that up and look at it right away? How do you review a mural board with thousands of sticky notes with all the little data on it? I mean, there's all kinds of challenges in the virtual thing around supporting panoramic thinking. And so in some ways, it's a devolution of thinking, but it could be an increase in relationship building if people are more intimate. Like now you're looking into people's living rooms. You're actually seeing something about them. And people are beginning to do inquiry about that. Like, wow, that's quite a library, Larry. What's on your third shelf up there? And, we start talking about it.
Yeah.
So it's hard to tell. I don't think we yet know what's really happening. And we haven't really hit blended territory yet, where half the team won't be. But I was just talking to my colleague yesterday who had to lead a blended meeting. He says it's just crazy.
Well, sorry,
some
David.
of Zoom and some are in the room.
I was going to say, unfortunately, we are faced with the limitations of the online meeting. So our time is actually coming to an end, although I'd love to continue this conversation at a different time. So one of the things we do like to wrap up with is something which we call simple rules. And I just like to quickly go around the horn. And if you have just sort of like one tip or trick based on today's conversation that you'd like to leave our audience with, that would be great. So, hey, Elisa, why don't you get started?
Well,
Sorry,
given the times that we're in, simple, less is more right now from my perspective.
Less is more. That's fair enough.
Less is more.
All right. Anybody else want to go next? Since I put Elisa in the spot, I will do that to the next person.
Yeah, I'd like to leave one. I think that central to the way organizations work internally is to better appreciate how each person thinks. Because they say, what were you thinking about when you made that decision? I think this approach helps people really capture how other people are thinking, because the images are better than the words. And I think if you looked at it the next day, you'd be able to say, oh, wow, I remember that picture because, Joan said X. That's what she was thinking.
I'm going to draw a little chiclet here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not sure how to
Laurie, do you want to do one, or David?
Yeah, I'll add one. And I'm with Elisa on the practicality channel here. When you're planning to do both team meetings, strategy meetings, or systems thinking illustrations, and you've got this mental model in your mind of how long it will take, multiply that by 3 to 4. It's in the old days. It used to be when you were working on your car, you'd say, I can do this. I can knock this off in an hour. Nah, you're still going to be out there tinkering with your tools in 3 or 4 hours. So that's my rule of thumb.
That's if you're working online.
If you're working online.
Yeah.
David?
I've got two. One is I just want to share Paul Sappho's definition. He says paper is brain interface. I like that saying. But the other one is in regard to facilitation. The rule that I really like to go by is don't ask right and wrong, ask what next. And so in some ways, this is a simple rule for navigating. So this is facilitating in this way is really not about being right because there are so many variations. But you do need a repertoire and you need to be able to suggest what next.
Well, I'll just, based on this conversation, I got 2 insights from today amongst many. But one is I think that there's a very powerful part of listening that I've heard by talking to some people in positive psychology that basically says you get more buy-in this way. Because when somebody's talking and you're writing down what they're saying, they see that there's value and meaning in what they say. And I think that actually helps the process. Just a thought I have. The other thing that I think is that I got insight today was you said that power of the river or whatever it is, that kind of going first, and how that's an enablement tool. I think that's a really important insight as well that came out of today's conversation. And I think a lot of leaders need to hear that message when they're trying to figure out what to do next. So again, really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you so much. I know everyone is busy, especially in these times. If you want to connect with anybody, you can reach them directly through our website, learningcommunities.com. We'll post links. The broadcast of the show will be on YouTube and Facebook if you want to watch the replay. And again, Larry, Elisa, Laurie, David, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate you taking your time and being on our show.
Joe, do you want a PDF of the graphics that I did?
Absolutely. And I'd love to make that available if anybody would like to see a copy of that, because it's a great record of what we were talking about today. But as we're closing out, if you can go back to just a couple of the graphics really quick, just to show a summary of what we did today. It's actually fairly impressive that you were able to do all of this in real time. And if nothing else, I think it's going to have a lot of shared meaning for people that were watching the show to provide the context of our conversation. So again, we appreciate that you gave us that initial starting point. Talked about how we do meetings, talking about the 4 flows and how that tied to the model and all the type of
We didn't do that.
full conversation, and really appreciate the capture. That one we didn't get to.
Yeah,
We'll leave that for another show.
the live notes aren't in there, and there's what I'm working
of Catalina in California. So on that note, again, thanks everybody. Like I always like to say, you can't drive a car, look in the rearview mirror. Look forward to seeing you in our next show. Have a good day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.